Hi, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a brief lecture on Hans Christian Andersen and Oscar Wilde to help you kind of understand their stories a little better, especially Hans Christian Andersen's. Christian Andersen was a really interesting kind of guy. He came from the lower class and became a huge celebrity and one of the most famous people in the world, probably the second most famous author in the world at the time, other than Charles Dickens. But he had a really interesting life. His dad was educated through the 5th grade, which for being in the lower class was pretty good at that time. He was the only literate person in the family. He ended up reading 1001 Arabian Nights to Hans Christian Andersen. And Hans Christian Andersen had also heard some oral stories from spinsters growing up. That was his kind of exposure to fairy tales. 1001 Arabian Nights, the most famous story from that is Aladdin. But it's basically a story that kind of starts off with an orgy scene. And there's a girl who I believe she's kind of being held hostage as a sex slave. But in order to keep from being subjected to that, for 1001 Nights, she has to tell a different story, which make up the stories. My son, after watching Aladdin, really wanted to read it, and we couldn't really get past the introduction because it was way too adult. Trying to read that whole thing, there's a lot in there that's very adult. What Hans Christian Andersen tried to do as a writer is he tried to write stories which dealt with adult feelings and adult themes, and then he would try to write them in a way that children could understand the stories. With himself and his personal life, his personal life and his beliefs had a lot of impact on his stories. He's a very religious guy. He also tried to put himself in some very kind of difficult positions with relationships. He'd always kind of pine after people he couldn't have. He'd fall in love with someone and decide that they're going to be together forever when it just wasn't to be. The first time he fell in love with a girl, he was a teenager, and he wrote her all these love letters. And she was kind of this very rich, pretty girl, and he thought that they were going to be together forever. And she wrote him back this really kind of nasty letter, which attacked him on a lot of different levels and a lot of long list of reasons that he was never going to be worthy to love her, etc. And so what he did is he tore the letter up into pieces and then put those pieces in a locket, which he wore around his neck for the rest of his life, so that he could always remember the rejection and keep the pain of the rejection close to him. He would often write love letters to people who are famous. One person was Jenny Lind. If you've seen The Greatest Showman, she's the famous singer that P.T. Barnum takes around the United States. He wrote her a number of letters trying to get her into a relationship with him, which was unsuccessful. He wrote to a lot of men as well. He wrote to someone who I believe was a duke, I think. And the duke wrote him back that he was flattered, but he was already married to a woman and he didn't want to violate his wife's trust. And so that we've got several letters that he'd written both to men and women. But he'd always pick people who, for various reasons in society at the time, he couldn't be with them. And he was constantly rejected. According to his diary, he died a virgin, but he also thought about sex just about every day, according to his diary, often multiple times a day. And so that's kind of Hans Christian Andersen. And the other thing about him is a lot of times that pain and that suffering would kind of come through in his stories. But he also believed, he had this kind of belief that was popular at the time. And the belief was that those who suffered more on earth would have better rewards in heaven. So it's also kind of believed that he'd set himself up for this pain in these situations in order so that he would get hurt, in order that he would have emotional trauma, because he thought the pain that he had from the emotional trauma would help him be better received in heaven. And that's a major theme in his stories, is suffering. And his characters always endure major hardship. Emperor's New Clothes is kind of the exception to that rule, but the rest of the stories he wrote, just about all of them, feature hardship and trauma and hardship. And they're very sad. And so he was very influential. Oscar Wilde was a famous writer who became most famous for his plays and his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, before being tried for homosexuality in 1895. He was sentenced to hard labor and died shortly thereafter. But when he started writing fairy tales. And he is very much inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's work. So I kind of wanted to let you guys know a little bit about them. And you'll be able to see the influence of trauma and emotion and pain and suffering on Hans Christian Andersen's work right away. When you read Oscar Wilde's The Happy Prince, you'll also see the influence of Hans Christian Andersen as well. But whereas Hans Christian Andersen's stories would always end sadly, as often end sadly as well, depending on your interpretation of it, there seems to be a little bit more hope in some ways in Oscar Wilde's. And I think Oscar Wilde's fairy tales, they're all of the ones that I've read are really great. He only wrote 2 short books of fairy tales. I think about 10 or 15 fairy tales in all. But they're some of the most beautiful and inspiring ones that I've read. So I hope that you guys enjoy those, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.